The old man's voice broke in the middle of the parking lot, thin as paper but sharp enough to cut through the roar of engines, when he clutched my sleeve and whispered, "Please, don't let my son see me eat. He likes it better when I'm weak." And in that moment I knew this wasn't just a sad story, it was a dangerous one. If stories about hidden cruelty, quiet resilience, and justice finding its way through unlikely hands matter to you, take a second right now to like and subscribe, because what unfolded next still sits heavy on my chest years later. I was there the afternoon it all came undone, but the truth is the story didn't start in that parking lot. It started months earlier, in a small, peeling house at the edge of town where time seemed to rot alongside the walls. Elias Crow was 81, stooped like the weight of the years had finally decided to collect all at once. His skin stretched thin over bones that looked too fragile to belong to a man who once worked steel for 3 decades. From the outside, you'd think he was being cared for. His son Daniel told everyone he'd stepped up, moved his father in, sacrificed his own freedom to do the right thing. People nodded when Daniel said it, the way they always do when responsibility is spoken with confidence. But I noticed things others didn't. Elias never spoke unless spoken to, and even then his words came carefully, as if each sentence had to pass inspection before leaving his mouth. His clothes hung loose, washed but threadbare, and his hands, those hands, shook not with age alone, but with hunger that had gone on far too long. I first met him at the discount grocery near the highway, a place bikers frequented because no one asked questions and the coffee was strong enough to peel paint. He stood there staring at a loaf of bread like it was a forbidden object, counting change with trembling fingers, whispering numbers under his breath as if afraid they'd hear him. When I offered to help, he flinched, eyes darting toward the door, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not supposed to," he said softly, and when I asked what he meant, he laughed, a small, embarrassed sound, and said his son handled the food now. That laugh haunted me later, because I would come to understand it was a reflex, something he'd learned to keep the peace. Over the next weeks, I saw him more often, sitting on the curb outside the pharmacy because he didn't have enough for his prescription refill, wandering the parking lot pretending to look for carts so he wouldn't have to go home just yet, always checking over his shoulder like a child afraid of being caught doing something wrong. Little things started adding up. Neighbors mentioned he never had visitors. The cashier said Daniel paid for groceries once a month and made a show of it, loud enough for everyone to hear, but Elias never came in with him. Then there was the day Elias collapsed near the vending machines, knees buckling as if his body simply ran out of fuel. I helped him sit, felt how light he was, how easily my hands wrapped around his arm, and when I asked when he'd last eaten, he stared at the ground for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. "Last night," he said finally, then corrected himself in a whisper. "I think." That was the first crack in the story Daniel told the world. The truth seeped out slowly, not because Elias wanted to expose it, but because hunger loosens secrets the way rust eats through iron. He told me Daniel rationed food like a punishment, said old people didn't need much, that wasting groceries on someone who's almost gone was stupid. He told me how his pension disappeared into Daniel's accounts, how the fridge was locked at night, how any complaint earned a mockery. "He says I should be grateful," Elias murmured once, voice shaking, "because at least he lets me stay." The worst part wasn't the starvation, it was the laughter. Elias said Daniel laughed when his hands shook too badly to hold a spoon, laughed when he got dizzy standing up, laughed and said, "Look at you, Dad. You're fading right on schedule." Every time Elias repeated those words, his shoulders curled inward, as if trying to disappear before the sentence finished. I wanted to call someone immediately, authorities, social services, anyone, but Elias begged me not to. "Hell no," he said, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "And then it'll be worse." Fear does that to people. It convinces them survival means silence. The turning point came the afternoon the bikers rolled in, engines thunderous against the cracked asphalt, leather vests heavy with patches and years. They weren't there for Elias. They were there for coffee and conversation, but fate doesn't always announce itself. Elias had finally accepted a sandwich from me, hands shaking as he took his first real bites in days, when the sound of motorcycles made him freeze. His eyes filled with panic, crumbs falling unnoticed as he whispered that line, the one I still hear in my sleep, about his son liking him weak. The bikers noticed. You don't spend a lifetime reading danger and miss something like that. One of them, a big man with a gray beard and eyes that missed nothing, knelt down so he wouldn't tower over Elias and asked gently if someone was hurting him. Elias tried to lie. He always did. But his body betrayed him. The way he clutched the food, the way tears slid down his cheeks without sound, the way he nodded once, barely, when the question was asked again. That was the moment everything shifted. The calm before consequences began to move. I didn't know then how far it would go, how loudly justice would arrive, or how badly Daniel had underestimated the power of people who don't laugh at weakness. But standing there, watching Elias eat in fear, I knew one thing for certain. This story was no longer going to stay quiet. The next morning felt heavier, like the town itself knew something was about to be exposed. I didn't sleep much after that parking lot encounter. Elias's words kept replaying in my head, especially the way he'd whispered them like a confession instead of an accusation. By noon, the same group of bikers had returned, not roaring in this time, but rolling in slow, deliberate, as if every turn of the wheel had purpose. They didn't announce anything. They didn't posture. They simply gathered around the outdoor table where Elias usually sat, coffee cups steaming, eyes alert. Elias arrived late, shuffling, more guarded than usual, and when he saw them his face drained of color. He tried to turn away, but one of the bikers, Ray, the gray-bearded one, stood and gently waved him over like you'd call a friend, not a victim. Elias hesitated, then sat, hands folded in his lap like a child waiting to be scolded. Ray didn't ask questions right away. He talked about the weather, about the road construction on Route 6, about nothing at all, letting Elias breathe. That patience did more than any interrogation ever could. Eventually, the story spilled out, uneven and halting, hunger woven through every sentence. Elias talked about locked cabinets, about Daniel counting slices of bread, about being told water was enough for dinner. The bikers listened without interrupting, their silence dense and focused. I watched their faces change, not into anger exactly, but into something colder, more resolved. When Elias finished, Ray nodded once and asked a simple question. Does your son know where you are right now? Elias shook his head, fear flickering again. Ray stood. Then we've got time. They didn't rush to Daniel's house. That was the part that surprised me most. Instead, they documented everything. Photos of Elias's arms, thin as broomsticks, the way his belt was cinched impossibly tight, the medication he'd been stretching by skipping doses. One of them called someone quietly, stepping away so Elias wouldn't hear. Another brought real food, hot, balanced, eaten slowly under watchful eyes. Elias cried while he ate, apologizing between bites like he was doing something wrong. No one told him to stop crying. They let him. By late afternoon, Ray told Elias they were going to take a short ride, just to clear the air. Elias panicked until Ray explained they weren't taking him anywhere he didn't want to go. You're not alone today, he said, voice steady. Not anymore. When they finally went to Daniel's house, it wasn't dramatic. No engines revving. No shouting. Just bikes parked neatly along the curb, leather vests visible enough to be unmistakable. Daniel opened the door with a grin that faltered the moment he saw who stood there. He tried to joke, tried to play the same confident role he always did, but the words fell flat. Ray spoke calmly, introducing himself and the others like neighbors stopping by, then asked if they could come in. Daniel refused. That was mistake number one. Ray didn't argue. He simply gestured to the open window behind Daniel, where the empty fridge was visible from the street, shelves bare except for condiments, and a half-empty bottle of water. Mistake number two was Daniel laughing. He doesn't need all that, he said, shrugging. Old people eat less. Ray's eyes hardened, just slightly. He asked Daniel where the pension checks went. Daniel scoffed. Ray pulled out a folder, bank statements, printed, organized, undeniable. The laughter stopped. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the quiet tension. Someone started recording. Daniel's voice rose, anger replacing arrogance, but Ray never matched it. He simply laid out the facts: elder neglect, financial exploitation, documented malnutrition. This isn't a conversation, Ray said. It's a reckoning. The police arrived faster than I expected, called not by the bikers, but by the evidence trail they'd already prepared. Daniel tried to protest, tried to blame Elias, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. When they led him away, Elias stood beside me, shaking, not from fear this time, but from release. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He just exhaled, long and deep, like he'd been holding his breath for years. That night, Elias didn't go back to that house. He stayed somewhere safe, warm, fed, watched over by people who understood that protection doesn't always look like force. As I left him, wrapped in a blanket with a real meal cooling beside him, he took my hand and said quietly, "I didn't think anyone would believe me." I squeezed his hand back, watching the bikers outside, engines silent under the streetlights, and realized something important. Justice hadn't arrived roaring. It had arrived listening first. The weeks that followed moved more gently, like the world had finally decided to give Elias time instead of taking it away. He was placed in a small assisted living home on the east side of town, nothing fancy, but clean, bright, and filled with the quiet rhythms of people who understood aging wasn't a failure. I visited him there often, and every time I did, he looked a little more solid. Cheeks less hollow, hands steadier, eyes clearer. Food arrived on a schedule, warm and plentiful, and no one watched him eat with judgment or mockery. The first time a nurse asked what he wanted for dinner, Elias froze, genuinely unsure how to answer. Choice was something he was relearning. Slowly, with encouragement, he found his voice again, and with it came stories about his years in the mill, about his late wife, about the son he'd raised and lost somewhere along the way. He didn't excuse Daniel, but he grieved him, which felt like the final, quiet truth of it all. Daniel's case didn't move quickly, but it moved steadily. The evidence was too clean, too thorough to dismiss. Elder abuse charges stuck, and financial exploitation followed close behind. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no speeches, just consequences unfolding the way they're supposed to when no one looks away. Elias was called to testify once. He was terrified, but he went. When he spoke, his voice shook, but it didn't break. He told the truth plainly, without embellishment, and when it was over, he sat down like a man who had finally set something heavy on the ground. The bikers didn't disappear after that. They checked in now and then, not intruding, just making sure things stayed right. Sometimes they brought coffee. Sometimes they brought nothing but conversation. Elias never treated them like heroes, and they never acted like ones. To him, they were simply people who'd listened when it mattered. One afternoon, as we sat in the common room watching sunlight crawl across the floor, Elias leaned back in his chair and said something that stayed with me. "Hunger changes how you see yourself," he said. "You start to believe you deserve it." He looked down at his hands, then up again, eyes clear. But being believed changes that back. On my last visit before winter set in, Elias walked me to the door himself. No cane, no shaking, just slow, careful steps taken with dignity. He smiled, real and unguarded, and told me he'd signed up for a woodworking class they offered on Thursdays. "Figured I'd make something useful again," he said. Outside, the air was cold, sharp with the promise of snow. As I drove away, I thought about how close he'd come to disappearing quietly, how easily cruelty hides behind closed doors when it wears the mask of family. This story didn't end with revenge or spectacle. It ended with nourishment, accountability, and a man reclaiming the right to exist without fear. And sometimes, that's the loudest ending of all.